Alright, so to remove this front cooler line, I've wedged a 16 millimeter onto the back connector that comes out of the transmission, and then we're going to use a 19 millimeter wrench on the actual connector here that's attached permanently to the cooler line. And we just want to leave that 16 millimeter wrench in place so it can create some tension for us to break this seal between the two of them. Okay, so there's the front one disconnected. It's draining now. Just had to turn that off with the 19 millimeter wrench. And you can see that the other part that the 16 millimeter is on right now has just remained in the transmission. So both of them are going to drain a little bit. You can just place the pan so that it catches fluid from both connectors. And take this off out of here. Make sure you tighten that if you loosened it accidentally until it's tight. And that's both the cooler lines disconnected. With the transmission cooler lines removed, our next step is going to be to put the transmission jack underneath the transmission. We're going to remove the cross member and the transmission mount, and then we're going to remove the torque converter housing bolts, the bell housing bolts. In the case of this 4.6 RE transmission, we have the dipstick connected with one of the bolts at the top of the bell housing, so we're going to take that out at the same time. Okay, so we have our transmission jack, and we just need to adjust all of this until it mates up with the transmission good underneath it. And then move it under the vehicle once we have it set up. I usually just loosen these arms and then get them to where they line up with the transmission pan, and then drop it back down and then tighten them again. And to even get the transmission jack on here, we need to break apart this exhaust connection right here. And first we want to take this connector here for the oxygen sensor and open it up so that we can remove/move this without damaging it. So there's a little tab. You want to pull on it. That should be good enough. And just put it somewhere it won't get in your way. And then we're going to want to hit these two bolts here with some penetrating oil. So just to be sure that they come apart for us. You know, a little PV blaster. And it's probably going to fall on me and make me smell really good. Alright. So, give those a minute. Chemical to soak in. Okay, and after we've let that soak in a while, I'm going to get in here. Let's see if we can just break this loose. I'm using 14 millimeter, and I'm using the 1/2 inch drive. And keep an eye on the bolt. In this case, the bolt is a stud, and it actually stays in place pretty good. But on some models, it's an actual bolt, and you'll need to put a wrench on the other side to get it to stay in place. Now mind you, once you get these off, the exhaust can fall, so try to keep an eye on it. Make sure you don't drop it on yourself. So there's the bottom one. And then get in here. Well, you could use an air tool for this, it might work a little faster. But there's not a ton of room in there for it, so it just depends on how tight or over tightened they were. If they were the right amount of tight, they should come right back apart. If they're over tightened, it may not be that easy. Alright, so there's both the nuts removed. You can see it's actually holding itself in place right now. That'll change once I move the transmission mount. Yeah, it doesn't look like it's going anywhere yet. Can try getting this collar free. Yeah, it's pretty tight on there. Okay, so that's going to stay put until I get the cross member removed, but that'll help us later. Okay, so here's the transmission jack aligned with the pan, and what we've done is we've cranked it up until it's up against the bottom of it, and we've oriented all four of the arms in such a way that they're all on the corners. So you want to move it till you think it's going to clear the exhaust, but also grab it in all four corners. You can see this one's a little bit looser than the rest. Now what we want to do is just drop the transmission jack where it is, and you can see that one moved quite a bit. So I'm going to move it back a little and line it up. And what we want ideally is to be able to drop the transmission jack without any of these moving, so that we can tighten them where it's going to grab the pan most effectively. So in this case, I'd move it back some. Right, we want it on all four corners in a way that won't get messed up when we drop it, so we'll drop it again. And I know it moved just slightly, so I'm going to move this one forward a little. So now we're going to tighten all four of these bolts on here and make sure that it matches up with the pan really good. Alright, so now I've tightened up the four arms on my transmission jack. I'm just going to lift it up into place. Hopefully it will hold the transmission just right. Don't be afraid to do this step a couple times. If your arms still seem like they're going to let the transmission slip off or just aren't perfectly lined up, just want to make sure we're grabbing a hold of the pan and that we can lift up on it effectively, that it's not going anywhere. Can also be a good idea to put a strap over it, so I'm going to do that next. Okay, when you go to put a strap over the transmission, you just want to make sure you don't get anything except the transmission underneath the strap. So no cooler lines, none of the wiring harness, none of that. So here's one half of my strap in place. This is just to make sure that in the process of removing the transmission we don't drop it off of the jack if it gets at a weird angle or anything. Just keep one less thing from going wrong. Alright, so take some slack out of this. I might want to move that even farther. Somehow that gives it the ability to be tightened. It's actually looking pretty good. I can still get to my ratchet. And you want to triple check. Just make sure your lines are free of it. You don't want to tighten it on one of the lines. Or it may get stuck. Also, the linkage needs to be on the outside of the strap. Alright, looks like I'm doing pretty good. Okay, there, now we're strapped to the transmission jack. And we can focus on taking apart, make sure the transmission jack is tight. We can focus on taking apart the cross member. So these two bolts here need to come out of the cross member. Show you them. They should both be 15 millimeter. Let me double check. And you can use an air ratchet to take these out or take them out by hand. Okay, yeah, our transmission jack is in place and we've got a strap on it. And then we're over here on the passenger side of the vehicle. Like I said, you could do this with a air ratchet if you want to. These have some weight on them. I'm going to hit them both with a little bit of PV blaster just to give them some liquidity. And this is a 15 millimeter socket I'm using here. And we just want to make sure we're backing them off and not tightening them like I just did. And you can see one of them has a slat and the other one does not. You can loosen the one with the slat at first, but then you want to take this other one all the way out before messing with the other side. Transmission may come down a little bit as soon as you remove these bolts. And mind you, the exhaust may come down a little bit too. Alright, so got that one loose enough. It's coming out by hand. Stick that in the magnetic tray so I can keep track of it. Now this one, it may move a little more. Now the exhaust shouldn't go anywhere because it is connected to the transmission mount. So for now, it should stay put. Alright, we're going to go over to the driver's side and do the same. Alright, we're over here on the driver's side of the transmission cross member. It's going to go ahead and hit these bolts with a little bit of PV blaster. And let's go ahead and take these free. It may have a little more weight on it this time than it did before. You can double check your transmission jack is all the way in place because it's about to hold the weight of the transmission. You want to be careful with these bolts and pay attention to what you're doing. They can get stripped out. It makes it much harder to install them again. And it's a unibody design, so these are being screwed into some inserts, not nuts. And those inserts can be very hard to replace. And we're on a 97 right now. In the 96 or before versions, they're even a little more fragile than this version. And the cross member is a different shape and location on those models by about 1.5 inches. Just FYI. Alright, last bolt. Alright, and with this bolt out, the cross member is floating freely. Now we just need to remove the center bolt from the cross member. Okay, so here's the transmission mount. It has a bolt going through it horizontally on this version. And you're just going to take an 18 millimeter socket on one end and an 18 millimeter wrench on the other end and remove that nut and then pull the entire bolt out. Alright, so I'm going to take the 18 millimeter wrench and put it on the end of the bolt right here to hold it in place. And I'm going to take an 18 millimeter socket on an extension and put it on the other side. And it generally should break without the wrench. Just going to back this off. At some point the wrench is going to start moving. I just want to get it caught up against the rest of the transmission mount right there. And as we take this bolt out, transmission mount is going to get lighter. And less connected. Again, you could do this with an air ratchet. Save yourself some time and effort. Alright, it's getting awful close there. Of course, I'm dripping trans fluid on myself. Alright, so there's my 18mm nut. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a hand on the cross member and push the bolt out of the transmission. Mind you, the weight's going to come on all at once. And there's your cross member. So we just want to put the cross member to one side or out of our way. I'm actually going to put the bolt back through it and put the nut back on the very end of the bolt just to make sure I can't misplace it. Alright, so now we are down to part of the transmission mount that is connected to the exhaust. So I wasn't totally certain about how much this exhaust weighs, and I have had it follow me before. So before I remove this bracket, I'm going to go ahead and add a little bottle jack on a piece of wood over here, just so there's something else holding it up, just in case. And then that'll give me some control over where it's at. So we're going to remove these 3 bolts in the transmission mount bracket, and they are 5/8. Got my 5/8 on a wobbly extension because the bracket might get in the way. And we're just going to get in there and see if we can get rid of those. Alright, you should be able to see all 3 of the bolts right now. And like I said, it's still connected to the exhaust over here. So you just want to be aware of how the exhaust is faring through all this. And we'll start with the back one. And I've got fluid dripping out of the cooler line, and I've got fluid dripping out of the back seal. So I've got pans under both of them. So something you're going to have to manage. Could take the pump to it again, just to make sure you've pumped out all the fluid you can. I might do that again right before I remove it. I'm going to do the one next to the exhaust next. Okay, and one more. Once I remove this last bolt, the exhaust is going to basically be free. I've got it on that jack, that'll hopefully hold it in place. And this plate will also be free, so it may come down. Be ready to grab it as this bolt gets loose. It is still hanging on the exhaust, so it might just swing. Either way, just be aware. It might weigh a little more than you expected it to. Alright, and there it is free. Just go ahead and pull the bolt out. And then it should slide on the exhaust hanger by wiggling it toward the rear of the vehicle. And that's the bracket. Alright, so now we're going to work on the torque converter housing bolts. We're up here on the front of the engine, and I've got a 14mm socket. This particular one goes in from the front. So I'm going to put my 14mm socket on it and work it backwards. Now on the other side, there is a nut. It doesn't feel like it's moving. But that nut attaches my dipstick tube on the other side. So it's not taking a lot of force to pull this off, but it is taking some. It does feel like the nut on the other side is free and turning, so I'm going to need to get a 14mm wrench to hold it in place. Okay, so I've got a 14mm stubby wrench, and I'm going to reach over onto the back side of the bell housing and place this wrench on the nut back there, hopefully in the right direction. Hold it in place. Let's see what happens. Alright, so that's holding onto it just barely. May take two hands. And let's see. Would have been great if I could have already gotten this piece of linkage out of my way. Appears to still not be cooperating. Alright, I've got it with one hand now. Still working around the linkage to hold this nut while removing the bolt. And it's going to slip off a few times. You're going to drop the wrench on your face a few times. Well, you might not, but it's definitely going to try to happen. All while fighting the linkage. And in this case, my light, so that you guys can see. There might come a point it's just easier to turn the nut. Normally these bolts go into the bell housing from the other side, but the 4.0 liter, this design is a little different. This is coming in from the front. Alright, let's see where we're at. Well, it's still got a lot of tightness to it. It's quite a bit looser than it was. Quite a bit more difficult when there's a nut involved. It's hard enough to take these out when all you've got to do is remove them. Now, of course, I'm doing the top ones first because the bottom two push the transmission onto the guide pins, and we want to make sure and do those last. Make our life as easy as possible. Let's see how we're doing. Getting closer. Are we having fun yet? Alright, so the bolt's out. Now there is another bolt up above the one I just took out, and sometimes to get at it I would use some really long extensions and an air ratchet all the way at the back of the vehicle, or at least the back of the transmission. I'm going to see today if I can reach up here. So I'm all the way on top of the transmission. Yeah, okay. And I'm removing the bolt that holds the dipstick to the bell housing. This bolt should go right into the engine block, and I've reached the end of where I can ratchet it. See if I can just reach up there, remove it without too much effort. I can spin it with my fingers. Alright, it is coming. So with this bolt removed, the engine dipstick is free. Alright, so there's the second of the 4 bolts that hold the bell housing to the transmission. Alright, so here we are on the passenger side, trying to remove the bell housing bolt. You can see there's the nut on the second bolt, and there are these lower bolts here that are the guide bolts, but we're going to take out the top 4 first. So just like the last one, I need to get in there with a 14mm socket on one side and a 14mm ratchet on the other side. So in this one, the nut is on the opposite side. So I'm going to put my ratcheting screwdriver on this side. Hopefully I can find a flat spot. Maybe once I break it, it'll move some. You can see I don't have a lot of clearance. You may be able to access these bolts from the top. It just depends. Starter's hanging in my way a little bit. See if I can change sides here. Might be easier. Put my socket on the back and put my small ratcheting screwdriver on the front. Alright. Well, that's working a little better. And actually, looks like I can turn this one off by hand. Not quite as tight as the other one was. Alright, so then I can push the 14mm bolt out. Seems like a lot less work than the other side. Now I'm just going to reach up along the bell housing. Now I'm just going to reach up along the bell housing and feel for the other bolt head. It sticks through into the engine block. But I might be able to break it with a standard one. The other option, of course, is to try and get in there with a small stubby ratchet, or to come at it from the rear of the vehicle with some really long extensions. Now, I haven't really brought the whole thing down much, so maybe to get to that top end I might want to come down slightly on the transmission jack. See if I can bring it down an inch or two. Alright, I wasn't having much luck with the little adjustable wrench, so I've got myself a stubby ratchet. Let's see if I can reach up in there and break that bolt with this. Mind you, I'm right underneath the wiring harness, so it's a little bit in my way. Okay, I could not break it loose with a short stubby, so I'm going to go in there with a full-size wrench. It may be a little difficult to get it seated onto the bolt, but I'm going to try. A few different angles till I get it seated on the bolt. Like I said before, sometimes you can pull the whole transmission down and get at these with some long extensions. If all else fails, that's what I'm going to have to do. Okay, but I am on the bolt now. And I managed to move it some. Alright, now that I've loosened it, probably get in there with a smaller wrench or the ratcheting wrench. Let's try that. Wiring harness really is in your way for this bolt. It can get kind of frustrating. Piece of the linkages too. Just be sure to take a break if your arm falls asleep. And be willing to switch tools. All that matters is that you're moving the bolt out. And at a certain point you might be able to start doing it by hand. Yep. Okay, I've got to the point where I can move it with my fingers. Alright, so this is the fourth bolt on the top of the transmission bell housing. Sometimes this job could happen by reaching down from the engine bay. It might be a little less excruciating than what I'm doing right now. Or it might be the same. Hard to say. Either way, you want to get it out and not lose it. So there's the fourth bolt. Alright, so now the only remaining two bolts are the two guide bolts at the bottom that connect the transmission to the engine. Alright, so we are on the passenger side of the vehicle, and you can see this nub right here that sticks out of the engine. That is the part the bolt goes into, and the bolt head is on the back side of the transmission housing right here. You can see that bolt right there. It's a 5/8 bolt, and we have the transmission held on the jack now, so I'm just going to start taking that bolt out. And these two guide bolts hold the engine and transmission together. It might make this a little easier to remove if you have a extension. Either way, it's a very long bolt, and you just need to have some patience to take it out. When you go to put the transmission back in, this bolt is going to be the first one you want to move. I can back it out by hand now. So there is the long guide bolt on the passenger side. And moving back over to the driver's side, you can see the bolt right there. Now that I've dropped the transmission a little bit, I may be able to get this piece of linkage free. Now it always looks like quite an endeavor to get it loose. Normally I try not to take these two pieces apart, but in this case I might end up having to do so. Need to push up on it and rotate until it comes free. And like I said, probably can only pull it off once you've actually dropped the transmission down a few inches. Getting pretty close. Blade is not happy coming off there. Alright. And there we go. So this entire piece of linkage can stay together and move up toward the engine bay out of the way. Boy, that was not easy. Alright, so now here's our 5/8 bolt. This is the last bolt holding the transmission to the car. After I take this bolt out, there will be basically nothing connecting the transmission. It'll just be free in space. And careful not to damage these cooler lines. They're getting knocked around a little bit, but don't beat them up too bad. And this one might take a little more force to get out than the other one did. Because it's the last bolt, it might have a little bit of weight on it. And you can hear as I'm breaking the transmission free, I'm getting a little more leakage out the back seal there. That's probably coming out of the torque converter. So I had to go move my transmission pans around because I was getting a lot of fluid there. Now that it's completely broken free. And you can see this is a really long bolt, so it might take a while to get it out of there. Be patient and also be aware both the transmission and the exhaust should be free after this point. Alright, so there we go. That's all the bolts out of the transmission. So now we're just going to need to move the transmission rearward and it will come out of the vehicle. Okay, so one of our last moves before we try to remove the transmission from the vehicle is going to be to get the dipstick disconnected. So the dipstick is right here on the passenger side, and we've already taken the top bolt out that holds it in place. So we just got to push up on it, and it just comes off like that. And if you go up to the top of the vehicle, you should be able to pull it up and out. Even if it is trapped, it shouldn't matter too much. As long as it's not still connected, it shouldn't get caught on. Alright, so there's the bottom of the transmission. And we are going to get a small C-clamp and attach it to the bottom of the bell housing. Let me go grab that. Alright, so I have this vice grip style C-clamp, and I'm just going to get in here. That's the flex plate we're looking at. We need to wait to put the clip on it. Torque converter is behind it. I'm just going to go in here now that that's off. Alright, so the transmission is moving back towards the rear of the vehicle, just slightly. And now that I've got it back, I probably can pull the dipstick tube down. Get that out of our way. We don't want getting crushed in the process here. So again, I'm getting caught on this clip. I need to move the transmission back and not get it caught on the exhaust. So I may need to go up slightly to clear the exhaust. Keep wiggling the entire thing back towards the rear of the vehicle. Now I'm going to go over to the other side and double check and make sure nothing is caught. So here we are back on the driver's side, and I'm going to take a look up here, take a look at all of our connectors. Alright, so both of those are free, and not seeing anything else attached. That's good. Let's try wiggling the whole transmission backward a little bit. You can see as it starts to tilt down, it's trying to get caught on those cooler lines. Alright, so up on the passenger side of the transmission, there may be a clip holding the... Yeah, there is. There's a clip holding the wiring harness in place. I still haven't removed. So let's see about getting that taken apart. Yeah, it's actually looks a lot like a zip tie, but it pulls out of this little metal bracket. Let me see if I can show it to you guys. Alright, so up in there is the small bracket. You just need to get in there with a pair of pliers and squeeze it and pull it out to disconnect the wiring harness so that the transmission can come out. Reaching up in there. Just want to get the pliers on either side. It's almost like a Christmas tree connector. Designed to go one way easily and the other way much more difficultly. It's not really a word. Yeah, whatever. You guys get what I'm saying. While I'm doing this, I'm technically just talking to myself. May help to have some longer pliers. Alright, so I have some extremely long pliers now. And going to see if I can come at it from below. Still pretty difficult to get in there. If you have a really small hand, you might be able to just reach in there and pinch it. You might also need to rotate it to get it to do what you need it to. Sure, there's a lot of people who would just break this thing. I'm not saying you can't be one of those people. It is pretty frustrating. The little metal plate it's on also might be able to be bent out slightly to make it easier. Even in an ideal situation, this might be a two-hand job. Alright, so I got part of it out. If I'm just patient, I can twist it, get the other part out. Alright, so now the wiring harness is disconnected. Let's really hope that our strap is only over the transmission itself. We should be able to check it out. What we're really looking at is making sure we clear this piece of the exhaust right here. Alright, to gain a little bit more clearance, I'm going to release my bottle jack that's holding the exhaust up and see if I can get it to come down slightly. It may still be trapped on the other side. Alright, I wiggled my exhaust around a little bit until it came loose and clammed down on the bottle jack just slightly. Still hanging in space. But hopefully out of my way at this point. Okay, so still moving backward on the transmission. Keeping an eye on those cooler lines. Making sure they're loose. We just got to get it to miss the hook on the exhaust. The hook on the exhaust where it connects to the transmission plate. And I'm coming over here to double check my cooler lines are still okay. See, I've got quite a bit of space going on between the transmission and the exhaust. Actually going to come down a little bit. And move it back again. Top of the transmission may be contacting the body of the vehicle at this point. And just keep watching for anything that might be stuck, or any place that you're not getting the kind of clearance you think you should be. Exhaust is pretty much not going to get completely out of our way. But we can get it to hang down so that it's mostly out of our way. And we'll put a jack under it later. Alright, so now that the exhaust is down, we should be able to come down quite a bit. Alright, so keep moving rearward. Alright. And then keep checking the clip on the exhaust. Try not to eat too much transmission fluid. Alright, and keep an eye on those cooler lines. Alright, so there's our transmission. Pretty much down and out. Still got to get it out from underneath the vehicle by moving it to one side. But we've cleared our exhaust and we've cleared our linkage. I'm going to go ahead and put the exhaust back up on this stand I created for it. And I may have to go out the driver's side of the vehicle because of the way the exhaust is set up. That's okay, it's not the end of the world. So here's our transmission. It's on the jack. Careful not to squish yourself. Right by the jack. And I may still need to raise the front of the vehicle up to actually get it out. Even though it's on the jack stands, I may need it up really high to get it out of here. So that's pretty close. I'm looking at my clip back. Make sure our torque converter doesn't fall out. I don't want it to. Let me go get the jack. Okay, so there is our 4.6 RE transmission removed from the vehicle and ready to be rebuilt. Be careful taking it off of the transmission jack because it is quite heavy. Alright, so here's the transmission with the torque converter removed. We already tipped it up on the bell housing to drain the fluid out of it, making it lighter so we can deal with it. And you can see I already spent some time cleaning some of it. And fluid makes a big mess, so just be ready for it. There's a lot of containers. Sometimes it's dripping out the back, sometimes it's dripping out the hole for the dipstick. That hole right there. And occasionally it'll come out of the pump in the front. Now we're going to try and get this up on the bench and tilt it up so we can take the overdrive unit off the transmission.